Thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our continuation of our seminar series called Grappling with Complexity. Today, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Rika Preiser. She is a senior researcher at the Center for Sustainable Transition at Stellenbosch University. Her research explores the conceptual development of complexity and how the study of features of dynamics of complex adaptive systems involve novel ways of thinking about and anticipating more equitable social ecological transformation processes towards resilient African futures. Her work is focused on the human experience to recognize the normative call to reimagine what it means to be human in the Anthropocene. In today's talk, entitled Exploring Complexity Through Relational Ethics, Rika will explore how a relational theory of change, understanding how things relate to one another, could shed light on sustainable development frameworks and practices based on the notion that complex systems come about through recursive and dynamic interactions. Rika aims to investigate how a relational ethics could guide decision-making that acknowledges the complex nature of human environment interconnections. So over to you, Rika. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Anton, for your introduction, and also thank you very much, Andrea, for the invitation to be a part of your webinar series. And yeah, it's really amazing to see just the participation and the action around it, the people you got together in this conversation. It's really amazing to see how much attention and interest there is in complexity work at the moment. And I think really we live in a time where more than 7 billion people on the planet of the Earth understand complexity through our lived experience of COVID. So I think that's, for me, a really amazing opportunity to speak also about our lived experience of what it means to be in a place of huge uncertainty and interconnectivity. So just thank you very much for that. I think I'm going to start sharing my screen, if that's okay. We are so used to that mode. Let me see if that works. And then, hang on, let me just try and minimize myself and then get the little thing on the go. Maybe just to say where I'm from. So yeah, I'm based at Stellenbosch University. I'm currently working from home, which is here in Cape Town. None of us have been to the office since 18 months. So it's kind of a weird experience, but I'm based here. And I think our center, which has recently got a new name, it's renamed, and Anton, you picked up on that. Our center is now named the Center for Sustainability Transitions, and used to be called a month ago Center for Complex Systems in Transition. And that center was sort of also a continuation of an earlier center which Paul Cilliers and Jannie Hofmeyer started. And I was their assistant in 2009, called the Center for Studies of Complexity. And I think there's been a continual sort of change and unfolding of the work that we're doing, and a lot of the change and the unfolding is in response to how people are using, I think, complexity thinking and ideas of complexity in real world situations. And I think a lot of the work where complexity and systems thinking are being applied at the moment is in sustainability research, where there's this sort of real tension between how do we understand the human nature interaction, and how do we start thinking about sustainability and thriving livelihoods, but also not just thinking about humans or not just thinking about nature, but thinking these two together. And I think also finding funding for, and I think that's a kind of a real issue at the moment, is we are seeing that these topics that we're dealing with are becoming more and more important in the world. But research institutions still find it difficult to place where to put people that are interested in complexity or in systems thinking or in integrative thinking within an institution. So our center has moved from the humanities to the natural sciences. Now we're in economic and business studies, or in the Faculty of Economics and Management in Stellenbosch University. And we've just moved out of the School of Public Leadership to be a center on our own, level 2 center. But still, most of our funding is from outside. We're a fully third stream income funded center, and all of us working there are working on contracts, research contracts, and grant money. There isn't any, university or faculty money coming in for any of us, apart from the directors. So that's kind of interested in and by itself to think, how do you fund research? How can we actually engage and continue to think and develop ideas around complexity for our respective fields of interest within a traditional research setting, and what are the boundaries that we have to sort of challenge to do that? And changing the name to Center for Sustainability Transitions, I think, gives us a little bit more leverage within the university and within the grant system, so that there's a broader number of themes that can be funded, but still, using the underlying lens of complexity systems thinking to inform the kind of work that we're doing. So mostly we're interested in the work that we're doing is, thinking about the nexus between food, water, energy, but also then how do we act in those spaces? How do we rethink development work from those spaces, science policy making? And and then I keep on pushing the boundaries to say, well, what are the concepts that we need to actually be informing these more practical things, and also even more, what are the spaces that we can create to collaborate around these. So just to say that. So my theme today, exploring complexity through relational ethics, is really still an unbaked theme. It is my dream theme that I'd like to work on, and it's something that I'd like to move towards, to start informing how do we think about action and applying complexity thinking in this space. And hopefully it will be something that can be developed within conversation. And I'm really also glad for that, to be part of the philosophy community today, again, where I haven't been for a very long time. So I feel a bit intimidated, strangely, by this talk. So just to say, and therefore my background has it's shifted a little bit more to think about the real world space. So I can't think about complexity these days anymore without thinking that it's an ontological phenomenon. I think when it started out in many other places a few years ago, many people were speaking about complexity as an epistemological phenomena, and thinking about what does this mean for how we can have knowledge of the world, or how we can, theorize about the world. But for me, the big shift really came when I started seeing, or when I started, embracing this idea that it is a real world phenomena, and it's actually ontological. And once we start making the shift to see how things are actually interconnected in such a way that we are co-constituting each other, the Anthropocene, or this big word that people are using in sustainability science or in geology, really for me is the example, the physical example of how interconnected we are in ways that humans cannot be seen as some kind of passive or some kind of element on the face of the earth, but our being on the earth is actually shaping earth systems in new ways that they've never been reshaped before. And in turn, those earth systems are shaping us back again. So if you read a little bit more deeper into this Anthropocene literature, you'll see that they have now classified humans, or the human impact on earth, to the same degree that earthquakes or landslides or tsunamis shape the structure of the earth systems. That is the degree to which our presence on the earth is actually reshaping the physical dimensions of the earth system. And for me, if we start understanding that this is the space in which we are living, how do we rethink the notion of complexity from that perspective? And I think that's being this notion is being imported into many places where research on complexity is being done. this is just from the University of Amsterdam, their Institute for Advanced Studies is saying, well, the biggest challenge today in the world really is understanding this interconnectedness of the world. We live in a world where everything is to be interwoven with everything else, and cause and effect are really hard to unravel. And understanding what kind of intervention will be producing what kind of outcome is becoming the biggest challenge of our time. And we've seen that with the COVID reality. Making small interventions here and there, not knowing how it will affect things, developing vaccines, not knowing how it will respond. And then at the same time, we're responding to, virus strains and behavior and conceptions that people have and capacities. So I think this is really just one of the biggest challenges of our time at the moment, is to understand how to intervene in a reality which is super connected, and not knowing what kind of outcomes our interventions will deliver. We're seeing this, as you've been saying also, Andrea, the interest in complexity now is bigger than ever before. We see it in various spaces. There are whole research centers around climate change research and sustainability research that are taking up this notion of interlinked social-ecological systems, human nature systems, and understanding or finding ways in which to engage with that. Policy briefs, huge kinds of intergovernmental panels on science are coming around to try and see how can we use complexity to inform policy in a certain way. So when John Urey from Lancaster University in 2005 already wrote about the complexity turn that's taking scientific spaces by storm, I think that's now more true than ever before. And we see that since the turn of the century, there's a growing engagement with complexity concepts across a wide range of scientific disciplines and social domains. This is a person, Ana Teixeira de Melo, that I just recently engaged with and connected with. She's a researcher in psychology in Portugal, and she's developing this idea of thinking complexity and seeing how thinking, what kind of structures this new sort of turn could inform and how we think about the world. She's developing that sort of space. As rightly sort of in a recent publication said that the rise of complexity science has led to a development of new language about systems. We are now engaging with and using themes and good terminology and concepts in our daily work as researchers and practitioners that we haven't used before. And this is creating a whole new mode of thinking that's more in relation or more congruent with the actual, our experience of reality. And as she rightly there says that even though this is a new language that we are sort of adopting, it seems that in many spaces that there's a kind of an undifferentiated usage of these concepts, which results in a lack of clarity and terminological confusion, which jeopardizes the heuristic and pragmatic value of this. And I think, Andrea, when you opened your webinar series, your first session, you said that your colleagues, cringe when they hear this word complexity, because for them it just means that there's this multiplicity of overwhelming everythingness, and what do we do with it? So I think what we are tasked to do is really to find clarity in the terminology, in the conceptual, and providing some conceptual map for people coming to the space. And I think that's really the kind of work that I've been doing the last few years. Also, I think, as Anna mentions here, the complexity turn has not just continued to expand the revolution initiated by systems thinking, but it's actually calling a more deeper and attention to the actual real properties of the world. So it's actually calling us to start seeing complexity and the features of complex systems as ontological properties, and to start understanding these in more nuanced ways. And I'll be using that a little bit today, just quickly to say, well, if we understand the features and the concepts of complexity in a more clear way, we can start thinking about applying them to, what are the implications for the work we do, but also for how to act and how to think about deeper things and what it means to be human in this world. So I think I'm just sort of probably preaching to the converted here, but I think it's just also for those who are coming from other spaces at the moment, just to sort of bring everyone on the same page once again. I think what we see that these ideas of complexity that originated really in the natural sciences around about the 1970s and 80s are now informing, and they've been translated to a whole bunch of other academic spaces. So you see people in social sciences, economic sciences, the humanities and management sciences adopting these principles or these ideas to start informing theories and frameworks in these academic domains. But there's also in the societal domains, like in monitoring and evaluation, policy making, the notion of strategic thinking, which informs business management, and sort of this notion of national and global governance, and sustainable development research. These are kind of more societal domains. In all of these spaces, people are also taking up the ideas of complexity thinking. But in all, I think if we wanted to sort of depart from a kind of agreed upon or kind of jargon-free definition of complexity, I think the work by Jean Bolton, and I think she'll be joining you later on in the webinar this year, and Brian Arthur, who's one of the kind of founding pioneers of complexity thinking, are for me standing out these days as kind of real world definitions of complexity. So there's a shift, I think, to be more clear about, or using a jargon-free kind of language in complexity thinking. And it's really about looking at the processes, the modes of organization, and the causal relations that form recursive patterns that constitute the structure and behavior of complex phenomena. And Brian Arthur says, common to all studies in complexity are systems with multiple elements adapting or reacting to the patterns these elements create. So there's almost a shift these days from thinking about complexity as elements of a system that are sort of now in some kind of arrangement that can interact to form a system, and then there's an inside of the system and an outside of the system. What we're seeing is there's a kind of a shift in that people are trying to engage with complexity from a process, more kind of a process understanding, which opens up the space conceptually, but also methodologically, to say that it's, once we start seeing how phenomena are interacting with each other, that are forming recognizable processes, that we can actually start looking at these processes and how they're sort of shaping each other and interconnected with each other, that defines this notion of complexity a little bit more. And I think if you start engaging with this definition, you move away from wanting to classify simplicity, complicatedness, complexity. That falls away in a sense, and you start seeing complexity as the space that is alive, that allows for movement and structure, but not too rigid. And you start focusing really more on the processes and underlying interactions that brings about these phenomena, rather than wanting to start classifying, is something now simple or is it complex? And for me, that was kind of liberating to start seeing complexity in this process-oriented way, rather than trying to put it into those boxes. So if we look at, I recently just did this kind of an informal literature review to see where is the state of, the current state of the art work being done on complexity. And I took a trip around the world, visited many complexity research institutes to see what is the kind of work that people are doing at the moment. And I see that there's different fields of study from where people's ideas of complexity originated that inform a fundamental different approaches or understandings of complexity. And one of the still the largest ways in which complexity thinking is used today is in what I would call computational approaches, which is almost the more natural science approach, which is the observation, analysis, and quantification of the behavior, the connections, and structures of complex systems, by means of mathematical equations, algorithms, and computational models. And a lot of, and I think that, I think from my philosophical perspective, I was trained to also by the work of Paul Sellier, tried to sort of look skeptically and negatively at this engagement with complexity, because for some of us, this still seemed like a reductionist mode of engaging with complexity. But I think what I've learned in the meantime is to see that we need also to be able to say something about how complex systems behave, what are probable outcomes, what are probable structures, what are probable patterns that might form. And these people and this research community is really done quite a lot to give to translate the underlying ideas of complexity to a range of other disciplines, and inform a range of different methods of engaging with complexity. And then there's more what I would call the qualitative approach, which is the approach that we've learned from Paul Sellier, which is about then translating those ideas from that we've sort of adapted and inherited or engaged with and translated from the natural sciences to try and say, well, what does this mean for how we understand how to be in this world, what it means to be human in the world, how does that guide our actions, how do we think about norms and values in different spaces, and how do we give some kind of qualitative understanding to that. And I would add a third way in which people are now these days using complexity, and these are practical approaches. More and more people are interested in applying complexity-based approaches to solve real-world problems, and there's a myriad of consultancies these days out there using systems ideas to implement in management decision making, but also in personal coaching, in organizational development, in policy making, in convening spaces for stakeholders to engage with, and there's toolkits and there's decision making diagrams, methods, intervention processes. These are growing in number and scope. And they are informing institutional forms. Like I say, there are so many consultancies, platforms, hubs, communities of practice that are using these ideas in everyday ways. We've been involved with a study called Wayfinder, which is really a kind of a process of intervention to scope the systemic nature of your process or your space in which you'd like to intervene. Yeah, it's been really well received in the development and institutional space. And then there's a work, for example, by others, David Snowden is one of those people that are using these as a kind of decision-making tool. And there's Michael Jackson in Hull from the UK that's used critical systems thinking in sort of understanding how we bound systems and how we make decisions and what are ethical implications. And there's strategic foresight and causal. There's a myriad of these things and how people are using that. And then there's a school of systems change, which are using these ideas really to think about how do we rethink collaboration, innovation, leadership, and systemic design to bring about change. So that's a bit of a mouthful, and I'll move just quickly to say how I've been thinking about this. What are things that we've been developing to help us think about complexity in a way that can bring people from outside into this space in a kind of an easy way, not an easy way, but in a way that can give conceptual anchors for people to engage with complexity. And I think what I've been trying to do also after reading everything almost that's out there is it seems that how you enter into this field of complexity thinking depends on who you read, and your ideas of complexity will also be shaped by the tradition or the scientific domains which you're coming from. And if you start reading, you'll see that there's so many concepts out there. It's like a minefield. If you Google complexity, you get everything under the sun, and there's 1,000 definitions. And we were thinking about how would we teach this to students? What is a way that we can actually clearly conceptualize things? And I probably influenced by watching my son play with Lego all the time and having to try and find ways to clean up and order and sort these things. I got inspired a little bit by this notion of a typology. And I thought, well, it seems that there's so many characteristics and features of complex systems out there. Many of these features and characteristics actually share underlying commonalities in the same way that you would look at birds or trees or plants that have certain underlying commonalities, you can have different birds that look, you have, they can look different and they have different features, but they have one underlying commonality, and it's that they have beaks that can eat seeds. And then you create a kind of topology or ordering system where you put these birds then in one category, and you say that, oh, they live in different spaces, they look different, but they have this one common feature, and we classify them according to that common feature. And this is a kind of I would say a loosely made on typology, but I tried to do that with the features of complex systems. And I came up also with 6 little, it's like the sorting tray of a printer, 6 kind of classifiable typologies to think about, I would say, even the meta features of complex systems. So to provide kind of a meta framework or for clustering features that are underlying the same, but they show up in the world in this common way. And I think this work has been interesting to do, and I think I wouldn't have been able to do that without any philosophical background. But it's a kind of intuitive way also of doing that. And that work we've published that in 2018, where we try to say, well, if you can understand those features in this way, we can think about human nature relations in a different way. And I'll say a little bit more about, I think I just need to say a little bit more about how that is done. So in this paper, I've scanned sort of, the main authors that have influenced some kind of discourse on complexity features. And I have, this is just one page of the table, but there's about 2 or 3 more authors' work that I looked at. But you'll see that if you read John Holland, you'll find, he has 7 features of what are complex systems. Brian Arthur and Stephen Durloff and David Lane, they have 6 features. Simon Levine, who's a biologist and very famous for working on complexity and evolutionary systems, he has 3 features. Then we know Paul Cillier has 12 features, and then there's a few others that have 4 and 3 and 6 and 5. So I tried to list all the features that these people are using, what their rationale for criteria were for for choosing those features, and how these work have been sort of applied. And I tried to cluster them then in these 6 categories to say, well, if you look at them and you want to classify them ontologically, how they actually show up in the world, there are 6 main, I would call them, underlying features that manifest those kinds of things. The first one I said is, if you look at one clustering, would be to say that complex systems appear in this world because they're relationally constituted. They're all process dependent, and they're defined more by their interactions than by their constituent parts and components. And if you look at that as the meta principle or meta category, you can see that, okay, well, what are features of complexity that align to, or that can be clustered under that? And then you see, oh, suddenly you have net-like structures, you have hierarchies, you have diversity, you have multiple components, rich structures, networks, all of these things, diversity, those are all the features and qualities of relations. And once you have that, you can actually start saying, okay, well, what are the practical implications of those features? And it frees you to not think anymore just about hierarchy or network or structures, but you can now actually say, well, what are the qualities that allow these things to come about? And then you can start thinking, you can generalize from there and say, well, it means then that relationships are actually key in everything that's complex. So we should study how things are related to each other. So the nature and structure of relationships between components in the systems have to be considered explicitly in any engagement with complexity. And that applies then to, if you want to do research or business or stakeholder engagement or policy engagement or organization building, the implication for that is collaborative processes should be fostered to build trust in social networks, and how do we invest in understanding how key relationships are, and diversity is important in that. So this is just an example of what this new conceptual framing can do. The second one I said is all complex systems come about once they've sort of manifested, they are radically open, which means that they systems don't exist in and of themselves, but they're always embedded in other systems or other structures. If you think of the immune system doesn't can't live by itself. We can't extract it and put it in a petri dish. It's radically open, and in this openness, it's also located within other systemic structures. And then you start seeing, oh well, you know, features like permeable boundaries, embeddedness, nestedness, exchange of matter and energy, teleconnections. These are all features that you can observe. And then you can say, okay, what are the practical implications of that? So it means, oh, everything, all complex systems should be considered as not closed, contained entities, but always shaped with what is around them, and even not just in the close proximity, but by far proximity. So understanding that what happens in Wuhan has implications in Cape Town. We have direct links to that in a sense. And what changes at local scale, that changes at local scales, and what individuals do have cumulative effects globally, and global effects have impacts locally as well. So we start shifting our idea and understanding of you know, where boundaries are and how we are sort of enmeshed in different things. The third component, or the third sort of I would say typology, is all complex systems are context dependent. The identity and the functions are defined by the context in which they exist. And if you change the context, the structure and the function of the systems will change, which means, and this is where it links a little bit to, yeah, I would say philosophical perspectives about, you know, how important context is. And this is probably where my roots to Derrida come back to inform something here. But it means that systems must be understood in the context of their environment. Changing a system affects both its systems, its subsystems, but also the environment. And this then transforms back, you know, the spaces that we engage with. So what it means is that where and how we engage with complex systems matter, and we should be taking that into consideration. I'm just checking the time. The fourth criteria, the fourth sort of typology is complex systems come about through kind of adaptive capacities. They are self-organizing, and their behavior is a response to changes in environment. And once you then translate into what are the qualities that you can observe, you see, are they self-generating, self-organizing, evolutionary, resilient, anticipatory? They have memory, learning. And this then means that if we want to intervene in systems to foster that adaptive capacity, we have to foster learning processes, collaborative processes, understand how resilience works, what are anticipatory models, how do we think about the future, and how do we guard against rapid planning and strategy and design for learning and change to take place. And fifth feature is that they're dynamic, and this is where all the kind of more technical language come in and say, well, this means that complex systems behave, we can recognize them by their non-linear dynamics, and then start using words like far from equilibrium, attractors, thresholds, regime shifts, tipping points, cross-scale interactions. And I think most of the sustainability work focus on this feature, where they are mapping systemic feedbacks, networks, thresholds, traps, and they're sort of doing the systems dynamics analysis and things around that. And then the last but not least is then we see that, you know, complexity comes about through complex causal structures, which means, and this is where the recursivity comes in, we see that the notion of emergence isn't just a bottom-up kind of process of how small things on lower levels causes higher level interactions, but these higher level patterns reshape, you know, I would say, lower level interactions in a way that is constantly changing, and there's long chains of reciprocal causality happening all the time. And we see that, you know, cause and effect cannot be traced back to linear causal trajectories. And this is where unpredictability and uncertainty comes in. So that's another mouthful, but I think these 6 kind of features in the typology that we've managed to sort of open up here and developed allows us really to then start thinking about, okay, so what are methods that you are using? If you are using that kind of research approach, or you have that knowledge kind of type, or you know, what aspect of complexity can that address or engage with? And we've just finished a handbook where we've actually tried to do such a kind of, I would say, use, understand how different methods that are currently used in sustainability research address certain aspects of those 6 features of complex systems. And this is where I can then now sort of cross over and say, well, if you come from this space now, by thinking of complexity in that way, what can we, from those sort of 6 underlying features, how can we use that to say, how do we make decisions differently, or how do we start thinking differently about what it means to be human in the world? And yeah, the work of Daniela Meadows is quite clear that living successfully in understanding that we're in a systemic world requires more of us than just our ability to calculate and analyze. It requires our full humanity, our rationality. So it requires all the calculation that we can do. Hence, all the kind of computation and qualifications that we can, but also our intuition, compassion, our vision, and our morality. So for me, this notion of a relational ethics of complexity is still quite unclear. I think I have more intuitive nature or knowing of what that should look like. But it's, for me, it would lie in developing a kind of understanding of an ethics that acknowledges this co-constitutedness of who we are in the world, that nature and humans cannot be seen as different entities in the system, but we are actually so closely linked that we can only appear in this world as seen as being co-constituted. And for me, I think we have to move beyond traditional classifications of what we think ethics, norms, and values are, but draw on a deeper knowing and a deeper understanding of how we see ourselves as humans and showing up. It doesn't mean that we will be throwing out rules and any kind of moral guidelines, but how do we step into the tension in which we use rules and regulations, normatives, norms and values in such a way that they give the structure and the meaning that we need to have meaningful engagement, but they are flexible enough to allow us to adapt and change in relation to the world that we see. Once again, I think about it as a kind of ethics of entanglement. And I know that work of Deleuze and Guattari, their ideas and understanding of the notion of assemblage and dragonfly, orchid kind of metaphors that they use. For me, that's the kind of metaphor I want to start using to think about what kind of ethics, how can we think about ethics in that way, where we see that meaning, truth, and norms are no more absolute than the networks or the structures from which they arise. It doesn't mean that they are arbitrary, but they are real and relationally constituted, and that we start engaging in this kind of, agonistic space. How do we think about human nature relationships from that perspective? How do we start seeing rule-making or norm-making as a kind of a partnership with diversity and context? So, and at the same time, what that will mean is that we will be grappling with complexity always. There's no, it's not a condition that needs to be, that we can solve, but actually it will, I think, allowing us to see ourselves in relation and deeply connected and embedded in relation to everything else might give us a new perspective of how we should be, thinking about such an ethics. So I think we are all called to find new metaphors and concepts and ideas about how we can do that. Recently, the work of Arturo Escobar, he's from South America, Designs for the Pluriverse. I found a lot of inspiration from his work, where he's sort of just saying, well, what would such a kind of commitment look like if we would like to? And it's more than just the Ubuntu idea, I think. The Ubuntu idea is really, I am because you are, but if we want to expand that to nature and to non-living entities, how do we reconceptualize such a kind of totally co-constitutive understanding of what is it that bring these structures about? And I think I'll conclude with a kind of a example, or just a vision of that, and draw from the work of Donna Haraway, where she says, by recognizing that we are being in and of this world, whilst shaping the conditions and possibilities for world making, we are called to remember that we require each other in unexpected, real and imaginary collaborations that are realized by being deeply aware that we become with each other, or not at all. And I think for me, that's actually the point of departure from where I'd like to engage with relationality and understanding complexity as a radical relationality, a radical co-constitutiveness, and being daring to see the links to such an extent that we can make new normative assumptions and ideals and hopes around such an understanding of what it means to be grappling with complexity. I'll stop sharing and open the floor for discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Rika. I'm going to totally abuse my position as chair and take the first question, and then I'll open it up for anybody else who would like to ask questions. You can also place your questions in the chat box, which I'll read out if you're more comfortable doing it that way. I think your observation about complexity being more an ontological study rather than an epistemic one is a really important observation. I was curious what you think the implications for academia and the structure of universities are going forward, given this sort of radical reconceptualization of thinking about the world. How would you structure a new type of university if it were up to you?
Yeah, I think if we want to take that seriously, then we would have to be working together, and we would learn how to, and the qualification, not just work together, but we shouldn't lose the depth of our own disciplinary backgrounds. So this is kind of probably the impossible, but I think we need good philosophers and good quantum physicists and good mathematicians and good geographers that are deeply that have deep knowledge of their own disciplines, but then that can at the same time from that depth make the translation to have a conversation about what it is that we need to learn to talk about these things together. And that's not easy to do. And I think I must say, I think many natural scientists have done that. I've been more daring in that instance. We've got Jean Bolton here, for example, who's a quantum physicist that's made this jump to action research and also now delving into philosophy and religion, or deeper studies of humanities. But as a social scientist, I must say I've not been brave enough to take a course on quantum physics or mathematics or modeling for that instance. But I think if we want to take the ontological status of complexity seriously, we need to have deep knowledge of our own disciplines and then be allowed to collaborate and work together in spaces that we can connect and exchange knowledge in order to learn from each other and to take hands around these problems. We've seen that for me, that's one of the amazing things we've seen happening in COVID. So medical researchers, virologists, working with epidemiologists, working with activists, health care professionals, working with sociologists, working with yeah, with so many different people coming together and trying to make decisions in a way. Yeah. So I think that's a huge challenge, and often funding structures are not open for that either. So maybe the university structures are ready to move, but funders are not ready to, commit to that at the moment.
It almost sounds like there's a possibility for the emergence of a new kind of academic as well, somebody that sort of slots in between these disciplines that are traditionally quite apart, that perhaps doesn't have that extreme depth of knowledge, but can traverse those different worlds and bring these specialists together to help solve problems. Okay, let's move on. We have some questions coming in. Andrea, would you like to just ask your question?
Sorry, yes, okay, I'm getting here. I was curious about, okay, so there are a lot of ethical ideals that seem to be there in theory, and the one that I've been kind of thinking about at the moment is this idea of rainbowism in South Africa, which is a kind of differentiation rather than splitting up into different parts. So it's very much to me a complexity ethic. A whole lot of different elements working with mutual respect for difference and an equal mutual respect for difference, that kind of thing. So it's a very nice ideal. And I think that complexity offers us very nice ideal ethical kind of situations, but there seem to be a lot of barriers for people to engage with a complexity, as we've seen with, I mean, certainly in South Africa, rainbowism is not a concept that's really taken off. Do you have any ideas about what the barriers are to thinking in complex ways, to acting in complex ways? So it would just be that kind of question, maybe tying it to the idea of rainbowism.
Yeah, so I think I would want to go even further than rainbowism, because it's almost about that idea of, yeah, so in a sense, and this is also almost, how do we reach deeper than just that? How do we have such a, I would say, I don't have the conceptual apparatus yet to maybe explain that, but I would almost want to say that rainbowism for me still departs from a kind of a tolerance mentality where we tolerance difference. I think there's a German philosopher at Frankfurt at the moment, I quickly forgot his name, I'll have to have a look at it again, where he's really sort of criticizing this idea of tolerance, because it means that you develop who you are and who you become, and you're tolerant to the extent that you have your own boundaries around which you will be able to engage with someone or not. Whereas another idea of a kind of a solidarity that is deeply rooted in a common understanding of what it is that we share, can allow us to go deeper than just that. That could allow us to see each other in ways that are that make us vulnerable to each other. So if we want to break through, I think these ideas of difference and similarity, or difference and sameness, I think we need to almost allow ourselves to reach deeper within ourselves and to be more vulnerable to difference. And I think what I'm saying is probably more intuitive. It's not very theoretical. And I think what we see is that understanding radical relationality really means that we're opening up parts of ourselves to ourselves and to others that shows how we are similar. So it almost goes much deeper to say, well, we're opening up to maybe even to some degree of to allowing to unlearn certain patterns within ourselves, to relearn other kinds of patterns, and to learn really kind of finding some common understanding within that. And it's not about giving up who you are, but once again, it's this kind of a deeper knowledge of who you are and what makes you appear in this world allows us to commit ourselves more deeply to the process of reconciliation, or the process of creating more human spaces for each other. So I think it's not just about being other and different, it's actually about the context as well. What we see in what's coming out of biology and biological understanding of complexity is that context is actually something active. It actively shapes what kinds of cells, what kind of interactions are being made possible or not. So in the work that we've been doing, we've created this word we called transformative space, where we take away the focus from who we are as different people showing up in a space, but allowing different kinds of relationships to emerge in that space. And we don't take control of what kind of relations emerge in that space, but we actually create a space where we disarm people from their roles. You know, we get in the UN director for whatever, and he will always just show up as that person. We disarm him from that role and we allow him to connect as a human being. We open up a space and say, well, start sharing what you dreamt last night. And suddenly this person has to share a really deep and intimate thing about himself to someone he hasn't met, but immediately they connect as humans and not as different, different people. And we realize on that level, we share the same fear and vulnerability in a sense. So not focusing on the difference and the sameness, but actually focusing on what is it that, what kind of different relations, dialogues and conversations can we have that exposes our common humanity with each other. So it's all experimental. There's nothing theoretical about it, but I think we've done a lot of work on that kind of practically to try and see how that works.
Okay, thanks so much. Yeah, big topic.
Great.
Yeah, thanks.
I see that Ragnar, you'd like to ask a question. You could just unmute yourself and ask away.
Hi. Okay, thanks very much. Both Rika, both you and Celia's have argued that complex systems cannot be reduced to some simple set of principles or rules, yet you both offer simple lists of characteristics of complex systems, which seems like a kind of reductionism. So I'm just wondering what the difference is between the reductionism you argue against and the apparent reductionism that you advocate.
That's a good question. Thank you for that, Ragnar. I think in the broader conversation about complexity, we realize that we cannot speak about complexity in its complexity. It's not humanly possible to do so. So although complexity brings forth to us a more rich view of the world and allows us to acknowledge things that Newton and the Enlightenment didn't allow to be real, it's still a reduction of the world. So I think, and this is what I worked a little bit on in my PhD thesis many years ago, is to say that even complexity is even speaking about complexity is a reduction of the world. We don't have a language or a means of communication about complexity to encapsulate everything. So I think I've also moved away to try and say, well, and this is still, I think, how many people are engaging or coming to the space to say, well, complexity is anti-reductionism, or it's holistic, or it's integrative, and Newtonian is reductionism and linear and those things. Yes, we have these different modes of speaking and languages of speaking and characterizing reality, but that's all that we have. And the only thing that we can do is to actually expand what complexity brings. For me is it expands the scope. It's like looking through a different, instrument and suddenly seeing, oh, there's much more out there. So X-rays allow us to see bones in our bodies, but if you do a CAT scan, you can see the soft tissue in the body. So it's almost like complexity allows us to see that there's much more that are actually real. The relations, the interactions, the emergence, the qualities of those features that come about. But still, that is only on a certain dimension. I think if we were dogs or plants, or we would understand a whole different spectrum of what is real. So yes, complexity is a language that allows us to speak about the more rich relational aspect of the world. But even that is a reduction. So I think in the thesis I said complexity is a kind of a post-reductionist position. It allows us to reflect on our limitations, and we will always have some of those limitations. So I think this is something that Paul always said, is that we only have language to speak. Even language is a reduction of who I am as a person, and that's why we have to create music and art and touch and feel each other to express a little bit of richer part of ourselves. But still we are limited in we can jump, skip and hop and swim, but we can't fly. So how do we express ourselves within the limitations that we have? So I think those 6 characteristics, or those 6 the typology of features, it's just a conceptual tool to help people to make sense of it, because it's so vast that people get lost in all of this. So it's one way of just providing some kind of map amongst many other maps. Yeah, but it's a huge challenge. I agree with you.
Thank you, Rika. Just conscious of time, so we're just going to do one last question. I just saw in the chat box, Bruce, you have a question. You're certainly more eloquent than I am. Would you just like to ask your question directly to Rika?
Sure, great. Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed your talk. I'm interested in how all of this cashes out for ethics, because when we often think of ethics, and probably the dominant idea in the world of what ethics should be is as a set of constraints or guides for action. We should have an ethical system that tells us what's right and wrong and all of those sorts of things. Now, I'm wondering if ethics within the space of complexity is a more descriptive, in a more descriptive mode rather than a normative mode. In other words, are we saying how things actually work? Is there any way within complexity to say how things ought to work? After all, complexity is about the unexpected. It's about, the autopoietic moment of creativity where things happen in a way that we can't anticipate. So how do you see ethics working when you're in a space where prediction is at the very least compromised?
Yeah, that remains for me the holy grail to answer that. I think I had a conversation last night with someone who worked closely in kind of the physics understanding of complexity, and they said that the initial understanding of complexity was born in this understanding that if you have systems that are too stable, like an ice block, there's no movement that's possible. If you have systems that are too chaotic, like water in a gas, no structure comes out of that. So complexity is actually, it emerges in that region where there's, on the edge, it's the middle space between chaos and stability. And even biological systems, even life can only come about in that space where there's this tension between some kind of restrictiveness and some kind of chaos or randomness. So an ethics for me of complexity should be almost drawing on those principles of what it means to keep things alive and to be resilient. So what we learn from resilience, and then this whole new kind of understanding of resilience, or how does an immune system work to protect us, is becoming a more generative metaphor or field to delve into to understand what the role of ethics is. So as humans, we'll die if we heat our proteins up to such a high degree that they'll come apart, but we'll also die if we're frozen. So how do we find ethics not as and how do we start thinking about ethics as not a number of rules and principles, but as actually conditions that would allow for optimal life to be preserved? And yes, I think we haven't managed to articulate that, but for me that would be the challenge of translating real ideas of complexity and the nature of it into a normative framework. And it could be combined, a descriptive and a normative thing, but it also, I think what Paul always said is, you can follow all the rules you want to. It doesn't make you an ethical person. What makes you an ethical person is the kind of person you want to be in relation to a specific context. And that shifts the notion of ethics not to rule following, but to actually the ethical agent, and understanding that I'm a good or bad person because of how I show up in the world rather than following rules or not. And I think people haven't really connected to that understanding of how we define good or bad.
Great, thanks.
Excellent. I'm just conscious of the fact that we're up at noon now. We have many other questions that have come in, and we can certainly talk about this topic all day long. Kushik has left some questions, and Chloe, so I'm just acknowledging that we've received them. I think what we'll do is we'll pass those on to Rika, and there might be opportunities to respond outside of this forum. But thank you very much, everybody, and big thank you to you, Rika. I've certainly learned a lot today, and I'm going to be watching this again to steal some of the references out of your presentation today.
Thank you very much. I'll send you the presentation. I've got a list of references attached to that. But thank you so much for what you're doing with this webinar, the different conversations that you're allowing and inviting around this space. I think it's desperately needed. And thank you for allowing me to be a part of this.
Oh no!
Excellent.
Thank you for being a part of it. We're the ones that are very, very grateful for it, and it's enormous. So it almost feels like every seminar we have, there's a wealth of a discussion to be had. So what I will do, as everyone knows, is I will post the recording on YouTube. And what I usually do with those recordings is I take the chat and I post that underneath. So I mean, if there's if you want to go into the chat there and have a look, then that will happen. I mean, well, you can do that there too. But I really hope that we will continue this conversation. The ethics part is fascinating to me, and it's massive. And I think that there's so much more we can do. But thank you so much. And yes, let's please all keep in contact. And yeah. I hate ending these things, but yes, thanks, Rika. I'm sure. All right.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.